When going to university, people fail to consider how big a choice choosing your accommodation is. In this video we're going to focus on accommodation supplied by the university, and I'm going to give you 5 things that I would watch out for when applying to accommodation. Number 1 for me is atmosphere and location. Now this means what sort of atmosphere do you want at your accommodation? Do you want it to be a quieter location, somewhere you can focus to study? Or do you want it a bit more lively, a bit more partyish? This decision for me was relatively easy. I don't mind going out and having a drink, but when I come back to my accommodation I like somewhere a bit more quiet. At Manchester there's 3 different accommodation types, the first of which is the city campus. Now this accommodation is well known for having a quieter lifestyle, being more focused on study. The second type is Fallowfield, and this is the party location. There's loads of different bars and clubs around the place, and the atmosphere is quite lively most of the time. The third of which is Victoria Park. Now this is where I am, and this is not known as the studying place, but it's a bit quieter than Fallowfield. Gives you that space to do your revision, to come back after a night out and know it's going to be quiet. The next thing you need to consider is the location. Now Fallowfield campus is 40 minutes from the university as a walk, whereas Victoria Park is only 20 minutes. So really, if you lived in Fallowfield, you have to get a bus pass, and that's something I didn't want to go down. It's an extra £250, it's really not worth it. The other thing you have to consider with location is the local amenities to the accommodation. So, is there many shops around, is there many bars, you have to travel far if you want to go to the supermarket. The next thing that you might not consider at first when applying is how many people you'll be sharing with. Now, this number can vary hugely from a minimum of 3 people or 2 people, right up to about 12 to 15 people in one flat. There are pros and cons to both, so if you went for a lower number flat, then this means you probably know the people a lot better, probably spend a bit more time with these people getting to know them, rather than being in a flat of 15. But the other thing is, if you don't happen to like somebody in your flat, then it's very hard to almost avoid them, you'll see them every day probably. The flat of 15 people, that gives you a bit more freedom. You probably go out as a group a bit more, you probably get to know a bit more people in your flat, but you might not be more tempted to speak to people. If you've already got 15 friends, then what's the point in going out and getting even more when you've already got your group? Number 2, price. Now this you might not think of at first, but the price of accommodation can vary. So I think the maximum price at Manchester is 145, and the lowest might be 119, say. So you need to have a look at your student loan, and you need to compare how much the total price for the year will be and how much you'll be getting in your student loan roughly. You might not be able to tell at the moment, but roughly judge how much you'll have to live off, because you don't want to be left with no money for the entire year because it's all gone on accommodation. The other thing to note here is that most of the accommodation will be pretty much similar. They might vary in, say, you might have a double bed in one room, or you might have a single bed, but these are very small changes. The third point to consider is, do you want an ensuite or not? Now, you need to ask yourself if you can survive without an ensuite, because more often than not, the ensuite rooms are more expensive than the ones which are shared bathrooms. So this point is dependent on you. Is it massively important to you to have an ensuite bathroom, and is it worth paying that extra money to have one? Or do you not really mind about sharing a bathroom? What usually happens is the ensuites, I've got mine there, just behind me, is the ensuites aren't actually as nice as the bigger bathrooms which people share. So mine's almost like a wet room where there's just a shower without even glass panels around it or anything. It's just a shower with a curtain round, and everywhere gets soaking. It's a nightmare, but I'd rather have that than to have to share with people, for the first year at least anyway. The fourth point to consider is catered accommodation. What I mean by this is that some halls will put on food for you. It's usually breakfast and an evening meal, and you get your drinks. It's like a buffet style sort of thing. These halls can work really well for students that aren't fussy and will eat most things, but if you are fussy and you don't like most foods, then this might not be suited to you. The worry with catered accommodation is, of course, what if the food isn't even nice? It might be like your old school canteen meals, and you get a choice of 2 or 3 options, and if you don't like any of them, you don't eat. So it's a question really of whether you'd rather have that security of knowing you've got food there, or would you rather have the freedom to make your own food and go out and do your own shopping? The other point to note here is that usually in catered halls the kitchen equipment isn't the best. So what this means is you might have a smaller kitchen but share between a lot more people. I think in some halls in Manchester the kitchen's probably half the size of mine, and I currently share with 4 people, but it's usually half the size and they share between 12 people, which means they have about half a drawer each and half a cupboard each, which if you're catered and you eat food then it's not a problem, but if you don't like something and you have to go and cook in a small kitchen, it might not be ideal. And I just want to mention as well that in this hall they actually don't even have a cooker. They have like a camping style cooker, and if you cook something in the oven then the hob doesn't work, so but that's uni life, you just have to brace yourself for that. The 5th point I'm going to say today is probably the most important point, and yet most people probably won't even look at this. And it's simply to look at the finer details of the hall. Now what do I mean by this? Well, usually halls are owned by the university, but sometimes they can be leased out to the uni, so the uni doesn't actually own them. And now what this means is that there can be some variation in halls rules or the sort of policies that are held at certain halls, but even in uni owned halls there can be different measures put in place at different halls. So when you're looking at applying to halls, then make sure you look at the special measures put in place at each hall. So is the hall a quiet zone, so there's no noise allowed, any noise complaints get dealt with, 0 tolerance on noise? Is the hall designed for a specific person? So some halls might say this is for couples coming to university together, this is for a family coming to university together, and obviously a student who wants to party going into a family hall probably isn't the most ideal situation. You want to look at what is provided by the accommodation. So does the accommodation have a bar on site? Currently my accommodation doesn't, whereas many other accommodations do. Does the accommodation have a gym or a library on it? What sort of things are important to you and what is provided by each accommodation? And make sure you have a look around to get the best one for you. So from my experience at Manchester, there was certain halls which were meant for couples, there were certain halls meant for families. Some halls had better options than others. So as I've said, halls can be leased out to universities, and my hall is actually leased to the university. So this means that there are slightly different rules at my halls than compared to other ones. For instance, at my halls, I have a 24-hour security lodge. Everything's accessed through a fob entry. So if you don't have your fob on you can't actually get into the accommodation site. So security wise, we're pretty sorted. Another thing which I actually missed when looking at accommodation and considering which one I wanted to apply to was that my accommodation actually has no Wi-Fi in the rooms. So the way to get around this is that I actually have to use an Ethernet cable and plug that into my computer. Then I have to get my computer on, do a hotspot from my computer to my laptop and phone, and it's a bit of a nightmare. So if looking back, then I might have applied to a different hall if I knew that before I applied. So if Wi-Fi was important to you and you couldn't live without Wi-Fi, then you wouldn't apply to such accommodation. So guys, that's my 5 tips for applying to accommodation at university. I will also be doing videos on private accommodation and doing house shares in the first year. Well, that's it for this video, so I'll see you next time.